Captain Jake Morrison's hands gripped the control stick as his F-16 Fighting Falcon screamed through the sky at 25,000 feet. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mountainous terrain below, but Jake's mind wasn't on the scenery. Intelligence reports had confirmed enemy movement in the valley ahead, and his mission was clear: provide air support for the ground troops who were pinned down by heavy fire. The radio crackled in his helmet.
Eagle 1, this is ground control. We've got friendlies taking heavy casualties in Sector 7. Need immediate air support. Jake's jaw tightened.
He'd been flying combat missions for 8 years, but the weight of responsibility never got easier. Down there, real people were fighting for their lives, counting on him to make the difference between going home to their families or not making it through the day.
Copy that, ground control. Eagle 1 inbound to Sector 7. ETA 2 minutes.
Jake banked his aircraft to the left, diving toward the coordinates. Through his heads-up display, he could see the smoke rising from the valley floor. The enemy had chosen their position well, using the rocky outcroppings and dense forest to hide their artillery positions while they hammered the Allied forces trapped in the open ground below. As Jake approached the target area, he could see muzzle flashes winking like deadly fireflies from the tree line. His targeting system locked onto the coordinates provided by the ground controller. The precision-guided munitions hanging beneath his wings would make quick work of the enemy positions, but he needed to be absolutely certain he had the right targets. Ground control, Eagle 1 has visual on Sector 7.
Confirmed targets are the artillery positions in the northern tree line. Confirmed, Eagle 1. Light 'em up.
Jake's finger moved to the weapons release button. Years of training had made this moment automatic, but he always took that extra second to double-check everything. Lives depended on accuracy. Both the lives of his own troops and the innocent civilians who might be in the area. The missiles streaked away from his aircraft, leaving thin contrails in the clear mountain air. Jake watched through his targeting pod as the weapons found their marks. Explosions erupted along the tree line, sending debris and smoke high into the air. Secondary explosions confirmed that he'd hit ammunition stores along with the artillery pieces. Direct hits, Eagle 1. Enemy fire has ceased. Outstanding work. Jake allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Another successful mission. Another day when his fellow soldiers would make it home. He pulled his aircraft into a climbing turn, preparing to return to base, when something caught his eye in the distance. A glint of metal reflected sunlight from a ridge about 3 miles to the east. Jake adjusted his sensors and zoomed in for a better look. What he saw made his blood run cold. A surface-to-air missile battery was setting up on the ridge, and it was already tracking his aircraft. Ground control, this is Eagle 1. I've got SAM activity on Ridge 77. They're painting me with targeting radar. Eagle 1, get out of there. That battery wasn't in our intelligence reports. Jake was already pulling his aircraft into evasive maneuvers, but he knew he was in trouble. The SAM site was a newer Russian system, one of the advanced models that had been showing up in the hands of enemy forces more frequently. These weren't the old, slow missiles he'd trained to avoid. These were fast, smart, and deadly. The warning tone in his cockpit began as a low buzz, then quickly escalated to a shrill alarm. His radar warning receiver was lighting up like a Christmas tree. Multiple missile launches detected. Jake's training kicked in as he deployed chaff and flares, trying to confuse the incoming missiles while pushing his aircraft to its limits. The first missile streaked past his canopy, missing by less than 50 feet. Jake felt the heat wash through the cockpit as the weapon's proximity fuse failed to detonate. He wasn't going to be lucky twice. The second missile was tracking perfectly. Its guidance system locked onto his aircraft's heat signature despite his countermeasures. Jake made a split-second decision that would save his life but doom his mission. He dove his aircraft toward the deck, using the terrain to break the missile's lock. The weapon flew past him and exploded against a cliff face, but Jake's relief was short-lived. His low-altitude maneuvering had put him directly in the path of the third missile. The explosion when it hit felt like being inside a giant's fist as it closed. Jake's aircraft shuddered and began to spin out of control. Warning lights blazed across his instrument panel as system after system failed. The smell of smoke filled his oxygen mask and he could see flames dancing along his port wing. Mayday! Mayday! Eagle 1 is hit and going down. Repeat. Eagle 1 is down. Jake fought with the controls, but it was hopeless. His aircraft was dying around him, and he was losing altitude fast. Below him, the mountainous terrain rushed up to meet him like a hungry giant. He had perhaps 30 seconds before impact. His hands moved automatically to the ejection sequence. Everything he'd learned in survival school flashed through his mind in an instant. Eject high enough to deploy his parachute safely, but low enough to minimize his time floating down where enemy fighters might spot him. Try to land near cover. Activate his emergency beacon only if he was certain friendly forces could reach him first. Eagle 1 ejecting! Jake pulled the ejection handle. The canopy blew away above him, and the rocket motor under his seat fired with tremendous force. In less than 2 seconds, he was thrown clear of his dying aircraft and into the thin mountain air. His parachute deployed automatically, jerking him upright as his plane continued its death spiral into the valley below. The explosion when his F-16 hit the mountainside echoed across the peaks like thunder. Jake watched pieces of his aircraft scatter across the rocky slope as he drifted down under his parachute. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he calculated the cost. $18 million and countless hours of maintenance work, all reduced to twisted metal and smoke in a matter of seconds. But he was alive, and that was what mattered now. The question was how long he would stay that way. Jake looked around as he descended, trying to get his bearings and plan his next moves. The terrain below was rough and heavily forested, which would provide cover but make movement difficult. He could see a stream winding through the valley bottom, which meant fresh water if he could reach it safely. More importantly, he could see trucks moving on a dirt road about 2 miles to the south. Even at this distance, Jake could tell they weren't friendly vehicles. The enemy was already responding to his shoot-down, racing to the crash site to look for survivors. They would find the wreckage of his aircraft easily enough, and when they didn't find his body, they'd start searching for him. Jake hit the ground harder than he would have liked, rolling awkwardly as his parachute dragged him several feet through the underbrush. He quickly gathered his chute and buried it under a pile of rocks and fallen branches. His survival vest contained everything he needed to stay alive for several days: water purification tablets, high-energy food bars, a first aid kit, and most importantly, his radio beacon and backup radio. As he checked his equipment, Jake took inventory of his situation. He was roughly 15 miles behind enemy lines, in mountainous terrain that would be difficult for rescue helicopters to navigate. His emergency beacon would bring help, but it would also bring the enemy if they were monitoring the right frequencies. He needed to find a defensible position and try to make contact with friendly forces without giving away his location to the enemy search teams. Jake oriented himself using his survival compass and the landmarks he'd memorized during his mission briefing. The nearest friendly positions were about 8 miles to the west, but between him and safety lay some of the roughest terrain in the region. The enemy would expect him to head in that direction, so they'd concentrate their search efforts along the most likely routes. Instead, Jake decided to head north, deeper into the mountains. It would be harder traveling, but it might confuse the search teams long enough for him to establish communication with his rescue team. He moved carefully through the forest, stopping frequently to listen for signs of pursuit. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance told him the enemy was already beginning their search in earnest. As Jake climbed higher into the mountains, he began to understand just how alone he was. The forest seemed to swallow every sound except his own breathing and the crunch of dead leaves under his boots. Every shadow might hide an enemy soldier. Every sound might be his last warning before capture or death. The weight of his situation settled on him like a physical burden. But Jake was no ordinary pilot. He'd grown up hunting in the woods of Montana, learning to move quietly and read the signs of the forest from his grandfather. His military training had built on those childhood skills, teaching him how to survive in hostile territory and evade enemy forces. If anyone could make it out of this situation alive, it was him. The radio in his survival vest crackled softly with encrypted chatter from friendly forces. Jake listened carefully, trying to piece together what was happening in the larger battle. It sounded like the ground forces he'd been supporting had successfully withdrawn from their exposed position after his airstrike had eliminated the enemy artillery. That was some comfort, at least. His mission had been successful even if it had cost him his aircraft and put him in mortal danger. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, Jake found what he was looking for: a small cave hidden behind a curtain of vegetation on a rocky cliff face. It would provide shelter from the elements and concealment from enemy searchers, while still giving him a good view of the approaches to his position. Jake settled in for what he knew would be a long and dangerous night. There was no way to know how long he might be stranded here, and rescue might be days away. Jake set up his radio and tried to make contact with his base, keeping his transmission short and coded to avoid detection by enemy monitoring equipment.
Any station, this is Eagle 1. Request immediate extraction from grid 7742. Repeat, Eagle 1 is alive and needs pickup. The response came back almost immediately, filled with static but unmistakably friendly. Eagle 1, this is Rescue Base. We have your position. Extraction team is being assembled. Maintain radio silence until 0600 hours. Help is coming. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. His people knew where he was and were coming for him. All he had to do was stay hidden and stay alive until they could reach him. How hard could that be? As if in answer to his unspoken question, Jake heard the sound of voices drifting up from the valley below. He crept to the edge of his hiding place and peered down through his small binoculars. What he saw made his heart sink. Enemy soldiers were setting up a camp directly below his position. They had tracking dogs with them, and even in the fading light, Jake could see they were well-equipped and organized. The enemy wasn't just searching randomly. They had a plan, and that plan apparently involved establishing a base camp right in the area where Jake was hiding. The dogs would make it almost impossible for him to move without being detected, and the soldiers looked like they were settling in for an extended search operation. Jake keyed his radio one more time, breaking the ordered radio silence because his situation had just become critical. Rescue Base. This is Eagle 1. Enemy forces have established a base camp at my location. Extraction will be extremely difficult. Request guidance. The response was immediate but not encouraging. Eagle 1, maintain position and avoid contact. Extraction team has been delayed due to weather. ETA now 36 hours minimum. 36 hours. Jake looked down at the enemy camp below and wondered if he could possibly stay hidden for a day and a half with search teams and dogs actively looking for him. The enemy soldiers were already spreading out in search patterns, and it was only a matter of time before they found the trail that led to his hiding place. Jake checked his sidearm and the survival knife on his belt. If it came down to a fight, he'd be badly outnumbered, but he wasn't going to be taken alive. Too many captured pilots had disappeared into enemy prisons, never to be seen again. Jake had no intention of becoming another statistic. As night fell over the mountains, Jake settled in to wait. Somewhere out there, his rescue team was preparing to come for him. All he had to do was survive until they arrived. In the valley below, enemy soldiers began lighting fires and setting up guard posts. The hunt for the downed American pilot was about to begin in earnest. Jake closed his eyes and tried to get some rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers. He would need all his strength and skill to survive what was coming. The mountains were vast and unforgiving, but they had also become his only ally in a deadly game of hide-and-seek that would determine whether he lived to see home again. The wind whistled through the peaks above him, carrying with it the sound of distant helicopters and the voices of men who wanted to capture or kill him. Jake Morrison was alone in enemy territory, but he was not without hope. His training, his determination, and his will to survive would be tested to their limits in the hours ahead. The real fight for his life was just beginning. Dawn broke slowly over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Jake Morrison had barely slept, spending the night listening to the sounds of the enemy search teams moving through the forest below his hiding place. The tracking dogs had come close to his position twice during the night, their handlers following scent trails that seemed to lead directly toward his cave. Each time, Jake had prepared for the worst, his hand on his sidearm, ready to fight his way out if discovered. But luck and careful preparation had kept him hidden. The cave entrance was positioned so that the mountain winds carried his scent away from the search paths, and the rocky terrain made it difficult for the dogs to maintain a consistent track. As morning light filtered through the forest canopy, Jake could see the enemy forces reorganizing for another day of searching. From his vantage point, Jake counted at least 30 soldiers spread across the valley floor and lower slopes. They had established a command post near a small clearing where 2 helicopters had landed during the night, bringing additional personnel and equipment. Radio chatter indicated they were bringing in more tracking dogs and possibly some kind of electronic detection equipment. Jake's situation had gone from bad to worse. The enemy wasn't treating this like a routine search for a downed pilot. They were conducting a military operation with significant resources dedicated to finding him. That suggested his capture was more important to them than he had initially realized. The reason became clear when Jake overheard radio communications from the enemy command post. His limited understanding of their language was enough to catch the key words: American pilot, intelligence value, and most ominously, alive only. They wanted him for interrogation, which meant they believed he had information valuable enough to justify this extensive search operation. Jake keyed his emergency radio, keeping his transmission brief and encoded. Rescue base Eagle 1. Enemy search intensified. Electronic detection equipment inbound. Request immediate extraction. The response was frustrating but expected. Eagle 1, extraction team still weather delayed. Maintain position. Do not compromise location. Jake clicked off the radio and considered his options. Staying hidden was becoming more difficult by the hour as the enemy search pattern grew more sophisticated. They were systematically checking every cave, overhang, and potential hiding place in the area. It was only a matter of time before they found him. Moving to a new location presented its own risks. The tracking dogs made it almost impossible to travel undetected, and the enemy had established observation posts on the surrounding peaks that would spot any movement in the open areas. Jake was effectively trapped in an ever-shrinking circle of safety. As if to emphasize his predicament, Jake heard the distinctive whine of approaching helicopters. He pressed himself deeper into his cave as two aircraft passed overhead, flying a search pattern that would systematically cover every square meter of the mountainside. One of the helicopters was equipped with thermal imaging equipment that could potentially detect his body heat even through rock and vegetation. Jake pulled out his emergency blanket, a thin sheet of material designed to reflect heat signatures, and wrapped it around himself. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it might help mask his thermal signature long enough for the helicopters to pass. He lay motionless in the back of his cave, barely breathing, as the aircraft circled overhead for what felt like an eternity. The helicopters finally moved on to search the next sector, but Jake knew they would be back. The thermal imaging had probably detected something, even if it wasn't a clear human signature. The enemy would investigate any anomalous readings, and it wouldn't take them long to work their way up the mountainside to his position. Jake made a decision that went against all his survival training, but might be his only chance. He was going to move during daylight, gambling that he could reach a better hiding place before the search teams closed in on his current position. It was incredibly risky, but staying put was beginning to look like certain capture. Jake packed his gear carefully, making sure nothing would rattle or reflect light as he moved. He checked his compass and studied the terrain below, looking for the safest route to the next ridgeline. There was a narrow ravine that wound up through the forest, providing some concealment from observation while leading toward higher ground where rescue helicopters might have a better chance of reaching him. Before leaving his cave, Jake took one last look at the enemy camp below. The soldiers were efficient and professional, moving with the confidence of experienced military units. These weren't hastily assembled militia forces, but well-trained troops who knew how to conduct search and capture operations. Jake had to respect their competence even as he planned to evade them. Jake slipped out of his cave and began moving up the ravine, staying low and moving carefully from cover to cover. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, which he took as a good sign. If the enemy search teams were moving through this area, the wildlife would have fallen silent. After an hour of careful movement, Jake had gained considerable altitude and put some distance between himself and the enemy base camp. The ravine opened onto a small plateau that offered good visibility in all directions while still providing cover from observation. Jake was beginning to think he might have successfully relocated when he heard the sound that made his blood freeze. Tracking dogs barking excitedly as they picked up a fresh scent trail. The dogs had found his route from the cave to the ravine. Jake could hear their handlers encouraging them as they began following his trail up through the forest. He had perhaps a 15-minute head start, but that advantage was shrinking rapidly. The dogs could move much faster through the terrain than he could while maintaining stealth. Jake abandoned any pretense of concealment and began moving as quickly as the terrain would allow. His goal was no longer to remain hidden, but to reach a position where he could call for immediate extraction before the enemy forces surrounded him. The radio in his vest crackled with increasing activity as enemy units coordinated their converging search pattern. As Jake climbed toward the next ridgeline, he could hear helicopters approaching from multiple directions. The enemy was bringing everything they had to bear on his position, confident that they had him cornered. Jake's only advantage now was his knowledge of mountain terrain and his physical conditioning from years of military training. The slope was steep and treacherous, covered with loose scree that shifted dangerously under his feet. Several times Jake nearly lost his footing, which would have sent him tumbling back down the mountainside into the arms of his pursuers. Behind him, he could hear the dogs getting closer, their barking echoing off the rocky peaks. Jake reached a small ledge and paused to catch his breath and assess his situation. Looking back, he could see the search teams spreading out below him, moving in a coordinated pattern that would soon cut off all his escape routes. Looking ahead, he could see that the ridgeline was still several hundred feet above him, and the terrain was getting more difficult with every step. Jake keyed his radio, no longer concerned about maintaining communication security. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Eagle 1. I am being pursued by enemy forces at grid 7755. Request immediate extraction. I cannot hold this position much longer." The response came back immediately. "Eagle 1 extraction team is airborne and inbound to your position. ETA 15 minutes. Can you hold for 15 minutes? 15 minutes. Jake looked down at the enemy forces closing in on him and knew it was going to be close. He could see soldiers beginning to climb the slope below him, and the tracking dogs were getting close enough that he could hear their heavy panting as they worked his scent trail. Jake continued climbing, pushing his body to its limits as he scrambled over loose rocks and through thorny vegetation. His hands were bleeding from gripping sharp stone edges, and his lungs burned from the thin mountain air and physical exertion. But he could also hear something new in the distance, the distinctive sound of American helicopters approaching at high speed. The rescue helicopters appeared over the western peaks like mechanical angels, flying in formation and moving fast toward Jake's position. But the enemy forces had heard them coming too, and Jake could see soldiers below him taking up defensive positions and preparing weapons to engage the incoming aircraft. One of the enemy helicopters rose from the valley floor to intercept the rescue formation, while ground troops began setting up portable surface-to-air missile systems. Jake realized that his rescue attempt was about to turn into a full-scale battle, with him trapped in the middle of a combat zone. Jake reached another ledge and took cover behind a large boulder as the first shots were fired below him. The enemy soldiers were now close enough that he could hear their radio communications clearly, and their tone indicated they knew the American rescue team was closing in. Orders were being given to capture the pilot at all costs before the rescue could be completed. The sound of gunfire echoed across the mountains as the rescue helicopters engaged the enemy aircraft. Jake watched through his binoculars as tracer rounds lit up the morning sky like deadly fireworks. One of the enemy helicopters took hits and began trailing smoke as it struggled to maintain altitude. But Jake's attention was quickly drawn back to more immediate concerns as enemy soldiers appeared on the ledge below him. They had abandoned the tracking dogs and were now climbing directly toward his position, moving fast and with obvious determination. Jake drew his sidearm and prepared to defend himself. The first soldier to appear over the edge of Jake's ledge was surprised to find the American pilot waiting for him with a pistol aimed at his chest. Jake's shot echoed across the mountainside, and the soldier fell back down the slope. But Jake knew that more would be coming, and he was running out of ammunition and options. Jake's radio crackled with urgent communications from the rescue team. "Eagle 1, we have visual on your position. Pop smoke and prepare for emergency extraction. We're coming down hot." Jake pulled out his signal flare and fired it into the sky, marking his position with bright red smoke that drifted across the mountainside in the morning breeze. One of the rescue helicopters immediately changed course and began descending toward his ledge, its door gunners laying down suppressing fire to keep the enemy soldiers at bay. But as the rescue helicopter approached, Jake could see that the enemy forces had anticipated this move. Soldiers were emerging from concealed positions all around the landing zone, and someone was bringing up a shoulder-fired missile launcher that could destroy the rescue aircraft before it could reach him. Jake made a split-second decision that probably saved both his life and the lives of the rescue crew. Instead of waiting for the helicopter to land on his ledge,
He leaped off the mountain face and into the open air, trusting that the helicopter crew could catch him in mid-fall. The sensation of falling through space with nothing but mountain air around him was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Jake could see the rescue helicopter racing to intercept his fall while enemy soldiers fired at both him and the aircraft from multiple positions on the mountainside. Strong hands grabbed Jake as he fell past the helicopter's open door, dragging him inside as the aircraft immediately pulled up and away from the mountain face. Enemy gunfire sparked off the helicopter's armor plating, and Jake could feel the aircraft shudder from multiple impacts. "Welcome aboard, Captain!" shouted one of the rescue crew members over the noise of engines and gunfire. "Let's get you home!" Jake looked back at the mountainside as the helicopter gained altitude and speed, putting distance between them and the enemy forces. He could see soldiers on the ledges below, some of them raising their weapons in futile gestures as the rescue aircraft moved out of range. But Jake's relief was short-lived. Looking ahead through the helicopter's windscreen, he could see that more enemy aircraft were approaching from multiple directions. The rescue was far from over, and the most dangerous part of their journey was still ahead of them. The enemy clearly had no intention of letting the American pilot escape alive. The rescue helicopter's pilot came over the intercom. "We've got multiple bogies inbound from the east and south. This is going to get interesting. Everyone hang on." Jake strapped himself into a seat and checked his rifle, which one of the crew members handed him. If they were going to have to fight their way out of this mountain valley, he wanted to contribute to their survival. After everything he'd been through, Jake Morrison was not about to let enemy forces prevent his rescue at the last moment. The rescue helicopter bucked and weaved through the mountain valleys as enemy aircraft closed in from multiple directions. Jake Morrison gripped his rifle and watched through the side windows as tracer rounds streaked past their aircraft like deadly meteors. The rescue was turning into a running gun battle, and the odds were not in their favor. "Multiple contacts bearing 270, called the helicopter's co-pilot. "Looks like they've scrambled everything they've got in the area." Jake could see what the co-pilot meant. 3 enemy helicopters were approaching from the west, while 2 fixed-wing aircraft were diving toward them from higher altitude. The enemy was coordinating a massive effort to prevent his escape, treating his rescue like a military operation of strategic importance. The rescue helicopter's door gunners opened fire as the enemy aircraft came into range. The sound was deafening inside the cramped passenger compartment, and spent brass casings bounced off the walls as the gunners poured suppressing fire toward their attackers. Jake added his own rifle fire to the barrage, though he knew his contribution was more symbolic than effective at these ranges. "We're taking hits," announced the pilot as sparks flew from the helicopter's instrument panel. "Hydraulic pressure is dropping on the primary system. We need to put some distance between us and these guys before we lose flight capability." The helicopter dove toward the deck, racing through a narrow canyon at an altitude that seemed impossibly low. Jake could see individual trees rushing past the windows as the pilot used the terrain to mask their movement from enemy radar. It was a dangerous gamble that required split-second timing and perfect knowledge of the local geography. Behind them, one of the pursuing enemy helicopters attempted to follow them into the canyon and misjudged the clearance. Jake watched through the rear window as the aircraft clipped a rocky outcropping and cartwheeled into the canyon wall in a spectacular explosion that lit up the morning sky. But the remaining enemy forces were still in hot pursuit, and they were gaining ground. "We're not going to make it to the extraction point," the pilot announced grimly. "Too many bad guys and too much damage to our aircraft. I'm going to have to put us down somewhere defensible and call for backup." Jake's heart sank. After everything he'd been through, it looked like he was going to be trapped in enemy territory again, this time with a wounded helicopter crew to protect. The pilot was already scanning the terrain below, looking for a suitable emergency landing site that they could defend until help arrived. "There," pointed the co-pilot toward a small clearing on a ridgeline. "Rocky ground, good sight lines, and only one approach route. If we can reach it, we might be able to hold out until the cavalry arrives." The helicopter struggled to gain altitude as they approached the landing zone. Black smoke was now trailing from the engine compartment, and Jake could hear the distinctive grinding sound of machinery operating beyond its design limits. They were going to make it to the ridge, but just barely. The landing was more of a controlled crash than a proper touchdown. The helicopter hit the rocky ground hard, bounced twice, and came to rest tilted at a dangerous angle. But they were down and alive, which was more than Jake had expected a few minutes earlier. "Everybody out!" ordered the pilot as he shut down what was left of the aircraft's systems.
"Set up a defensive perimeter. This bird isn't going anywhere, so we're going to have to make our stand right here."
Jake grabbed his gear and followed the crew members out of the disabled helicopter. The ridgetop was about 50 meters across, covered with loose rock and scattered boulders that would provide decent cover for a defensive position. More importantly, the enemy would have to attack uphill across open ground to reach them. The rescue crew consisted of 4 men besides Jake, the pilot, co-pilot, and 2 door gunners who doubled as para-rescue specialists. They were all experienced combat veterans who knew how to set up a hasty defense, and they moved with practiced efficiency as they established fighting positions around the helicopter. "How long until backup arrives?" Jake asked the pilot as they dragged ammunition and supplies from the aircraft. "Could be 2 hours, could be 6, came the honest reply. "Depends on what assets are available and how long it takes to clear out the enemy air defenses. We're pretty much on our own until then." Jake checked his weapon and ammunition supply. He had his sidearm and the rifle the crew had given him, plus about 200 rounds of ammunition. It wasn't much for an extended firefight, but it would have to do. The crew members were better equipped, but they were also dealing with equipment damaged in the emergency landing. The sound of approaching helicopters echoed across the valley below them. The enemy forces had followed their smoke trail and were closing in on their position. Jake counted at least 2 aircraft, probably carrying a full squad of soldiers each. They would soon be outnumbered by at least 4 to 1. "Here they come," announced one of the door gunners as he sighted his machine gun on the approaching aircraft. "Looks like they're going to try to land troops in the valley and attack us from below." Jake watched through his binoculars as the enemy helicopters touched down about half a mile away. Soldiers poured out of the aircraft and immediately began moving toward the ridge in organized assault formations. These were clearly experienced troops who knew how to conduct this type of operation. "We've got movement on the north slope," called the co-pilot from his position behind a boulder. "Looks like they're trying to flank us from that direction too." Jake looked where the co-pilot was pointing and saw another group of soldiers working their way up the mountainside. The enemy was conducting a coordinated attack from multiple directions, trying to overwhelm their small defensive force through superior numbers and firepower. The first shots came from the soldiers advancing up the main approach route. Jake aimed carefully and fired, watching one of the attackers stumble and fall behind cover. The battle for the ridgetop had begun, and Jake knew it was going to be a fight to the death. For the next hour, the small group of Americans held their position against repeated enemy attacks. The enemy soldiers were brave and determined, but they were attacking uphill against defenders who had good cover and excellent fields of fire. Bodies began to accumulate in the rocky approaches to the ridge as attack after attack was repulsed, but Jake could see that their situation was deteriorating steadily. They were running low on ammunition, and the enemy was bringing up heavier weapons, including mortars that could reach their position despite the elevation advantage. It was only a matter of time before their defensive position became untenable. "We need to move to a secondary position," announced the pilot during a brief lull in the fighting. "They're going to start dropping mortar rounds on us, and we can't survive that in the open." Jake looked around the ridgetop and realized the pilot was right. They had chosen the position for its defensive advantages, but those same advantages became weaknesses when facing indirect fire weapons. They needed to find cover that would protect them from artillery while still allowing them to defend against ground assault. "There's a cave system about 200 meters to the east," pointed out one of the door gunners. "Saw it on the approach. Natural rock formation that should stop anything short of a direct hit from heavy artillery." Moving to the cave meant abandoning their current positions and crossing open ground under enemy observation, but staying where they were meant certain death when the mortar bombardment began. Jake checked his ammunition one more time and prepared to move. The dash to the cave system was the longest 200 meters Jake had ever covered. Enemy snipers fired at them from multiple positions as they ran across the rocky ground, dodging and weaving to avoid the incoming rounds. One of the door gunners took a hit in the shoulder but kept moving, supported by his partner. The caves were everything the gunner had promised, deep enough to provide protection from artillery, but with narrow openings that could be defended against infantry assault.
Jake and the rescue crew set up their new defensive positions just as the first mortar rounds began falling on their abandoned helicopter. The explosions shook dust and rock fragments from the cave ceiling, but the Americans were safe from the indirect fire weapons. Now they had to prepare for the inevitable infantry assault as enemy forces closed in on their new position. Jake positioned himself at one of the cave entrances, rifle ready, and waited for the next phase of the battle. What he saw emerging from the smoke and dust below made his heart sink. The enemy had brought up armored vehicles and heavy machine guns, along with what looked like at least 2 full companies of infantry. The small group of American defenders was about to face overwhelming odds in a position that suddenly didn't look nearly as defensible as it had a few minutes earlier. Jake's radio crackled with an incoming transmission. Eagle 1, this is Rescue Command. We have assets inbound to your position. Can you mark your location and maintain defensive positions for another 30 minutes? 30 minutes. Jake looked at the enemy forces deploying below their cave system and wondered if they could hold out for 30 seconds, let alone 30 minutes. But he keyed his radio and responded with as much confidence as he could muster. Roger, Rescue Command. We can hold for 30 minutes. Just make sure those assets are loaded for bear when they get here. The final phase of the battle for Jake Morrison's freedom was about to begin, and the odds had never looked worse. But somewhere in the distance, friendly forces were racing to their aid, and Jake was determined to survive long enough for help to arrive. The question was whether determination would be enough against the overwhelming force that was preparing to assault their position. The enemy assault on the cave system began with a thunderous artillery barrage that shook the entire mountain. Jake Morrison pressed himself against the rocky wall as explosive shells detonated all around their position, sending cascades of stone fragments bouncing through the narrow passages. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar that made communication impossible and left his ears ringing even during brief pauses in the bombardment. When the artillery fire finally lifted, Jake could hear the enemy infantry beginning their advance up the slope toward the caves. They were moving in coordinated waves, using covering fire and tactical movements that showed these were experienced soldiers who understood how to assault a fortified position. Jake positioned his rifle at one of the cave entrances and prepared to make every shot count. The first enemy soldiers to appear in Jake's sights were moving cautiously, aware that they were approaching a defended position. Jake aimed carefully and squeezed the trigger, watching the lead soldier fall as his shot found its mark. The sound of gunfire echoed through the caves as the other rescue crew members opened fire from their positions, trying to hold back the advancing infantry. But Jake could see immediately that their situation was hopeless. The enemy had too many soldiers and too much firepower for the small American force to resist for long. Enemy machine guns were setting up in positions that would allow them to pour suppressing fire into the cave entrances, while infantry squads flanked around to assault from multiple directions. "They're bringing up rocket launchers," called out the helicopter pilot from his position deeper in the cave system. "We need to fall back to the inner chambers before they start firing into our positions." Jake reluctantly abandoned his firing position and followed the others deeper into the mountain. The cave system was more extensive than they had initially realized, with multiple chambers and connecting passages that might allow them to evade the enemy forces for a while longer. But Jake knew they were just delaying the inevitable. Eventually, the enemy would corner them, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. As they moved through the dark passages, Jake's radio crackled with another transmission from Rescue Command. "Eagle 1, be advised that rescue assets are encountering heavy resistance. Your extraction may be delayed beyond the original 30-minute estimate." Jake's heart sank as he processed this information. The rescue force was being engaged by enemy forces before it could reach their position, which meant help might not arrive at all. He was beginning to think that his escape from the original crash site had only delayed his capture, not prevented it. The sound of enemy soldiers entering the cave system reached them even in the inner chambers. Voices echoed through the rocky passages as search teams began working their way through the complex, systematically checking each chamber and corridor. Jake and the rescue crew found themselves in an increasingly desperate game of hide-and-seek with an enemy force that had all the advantages. "We need to split up," whispered the helicopter pilot. "If we stay together, they'll get all of us when they find us. If we scatter, maybe one or two of us can evade capture and get word back to our people about what happened here." It was sound tactical thinking, but Jake didn't like the idea of abandoning the men who had risked their lives to rescue him.
These crew members had come into enemy territory specifically to bring him home, and now they were trapped because of his situation. Jake felt responsible for their predicament, even though he knew logically that they had all been doing their duty. Before they could implement the pilot's plan, enemy soldiers appeared at the entrance to their chamber. Jake raised his rifle, but he could see immediately that resistance was futile. There were at least a dozen soldiers with automatic weapons pointed at them, and any attempt to fight would result in their immediate deaths. "Drop your weapons," commanded an enemy officer in accented English. "You are surrounded and have no chance of escape. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to the laws of warfare." Jake looked at his companions and saw the same resignation in their eyes that he felt. They had fought as hard and as long as they could, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. Slowly, reluctantly, Jake lowered his rifle and placed it on the ground. The capture process was swift and professional. Enemy soldiers searched each American thoroughly, confiscated all weapons and equipment, and bound their hands with plastic restraints. Jake found himself being marched out of the cave system at gunpoint, squinting in the bright afternoon sunlight after hours in the dark underground chambers. What Jake saw outside the caves surprised him. The enemy force that had captured them was much larger than he had realized, with armored vehicles, artillery pieces, and what looked like at least a full battalion of infantry. This was no hastily organized search party, but a major military operation dedicated to preventing his escape. Jake was separated from the helicopter crew and placed in a different vehicle for transport. As they drove away from the battle site, he caught a glimpse of aircraft on the distant horizon that might have been the delayed rescue force finally arriving, but they were too late to change the outcome of this particular engagement. The enemy transport convoy wound its way through mountain valleys for several hours, taking a circuitous route that Jake assumed was designed to confuse any potential rescue attempts. They passed through several checkpoints and defensive positions that indicated this was well-controlled enemy territory, not just a temporary occupation. As evening approached, the convoy arrived at what appeared to be a major military installation built into a mountain valley. Jake could see communications antennas, radar installations, and heavily fortified positions that suggested this was an important command center for enemy operations in the region. His presence here was clearly considered significant by the enemy leadership. Jake was taken to a holding cell that was surprisingly clean and well-equipped. He had expected rough treatment and primitive conditions, but his captors seemed to be following international protocols for prisoner treatment. He was given food, water, and basic medical attention for the cuts and bruises he had sustained during his ordeal. But Jake knew this civilized treatment was probably temporary. Once his captors had time to organize a proper interrogation program, things would likely become much more unpleasant. Enemy intelligence services would want to know everything about his mission, his aircraft's capabilities, and American military operations in the region. 3 days passed before the interrogations began. Jake was taken to a windowless room where 2 enemy intelligence officers waited with recording equipment and thick files of documents. They were polite but persistent, asking detailed questions about Jake's military background, training, and current assignment. Jake provided only his name, rank, and service number, as required by military regulations and international law. But his interrogators seemed to know a great deal about him already, referencing details about his career and personal life that could only have come from extensive intelligence-gathering operations. "Captain Morrison," said the senior interrogator in excellent English, "we know you are not just an ordinary pilot. Your aircraft was equipped with specialized reconnaissance equipment, and your mission parameters suggest you were gathering intelligence on our defensive positions. We simply want to confirm what we already know." Jake maintained his silence, but he was disturbed by how much accurate information his captors possessed. Either they had human intelligence sources within American military units, or their electronic surveillance capabilities were more advanced than anyone had realized. The interrogation sessions continued for several days, with the enemy officers becoming more insistent and less polite as Jake continued to refuse cooperation. They threatened consequences for his fellow crew members, who were apparently being held in a different part of the facility, if he didn't provide the information they wanted. Jake tried to maintain hope that rescue efforts were continuing, but as the days turned into weeks, he began to accept that he might be a prisoner for a very long time. His captors seemed confident that their location was secure from American military action, and they showed no signs of concern about potential rescue attempts. What Jake didn't know was that his capture had triggered a massive intelligence operation by American forces to locate and extract him. High-level government officials had determined that his knowledge of sensitive military technologies made his rescue a national security priority, and resources were being mobilized for an operation unlike anything attempted before. Miles away from Jake's prison, in the rugged mountains that surrounded the enemy installation, American Special Operations Forces were conducting reconnaissance missions to gather intelligence about the facility's defenses and guard procedures. Among them was Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a sniper whose marksmanship skills had made him legendary within the special operations community. Rodriguez had been studying the enemy installation through his scope for 3 days, learning the patterns of guard rotations and identifying key vulnerabilities in the perimeter defenses. His mission was to provide overwatch for the extraction team when they made their assault on the facility. But Rodriguez was beginning to think that a more direct approach might be necessary. Through his high-powered scope, Rodriguez could see into some of the facility's windows, and he had identified what he believed to be the building where Jake Morrison was being held. The problem was that the prisoner was always under guard, and any rescue attempt would have to overcome significant enemy forces before it could succeed. Rodriguez was a professional soldier who followed orders and worked as part of a team. But he was also a man who understood that sometimes individual initiative could accomplish what elaborate plans could not. As he watched the enemy facility through his scope, Rodriguez began to formulate a plan that could change everything. The decision he was contemplating would violate direct orders and put his own life at extreme risk. But it might also be Jake Morrison's only chance for freedom. Rodriguez had never met the captured pilot, but he understood the responsibility that came with being in a position to save a fellow American's life. The choice that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez would make in the coming hours would determine whether Captain Jake Morrison ever saw home again. In the isolation of his mountain hide site, with enemy forces spread out below him like pieces on a chessboard, one sniper was about to make the decision that would define the rest of his military career and possibly cost him his life. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez lay motionless on the rocky outcropping, his sniper rifle steady on its bipod as he observed the enemy installation through his powerful scope. For 6 days he had been watching, learning, waiting. The official rescue operation had been postponed twice due to intelligence concerns about enemy reinforcements in the area. But Rodriguez knew that time was running out for Captain Jake Morrison. Through his scope, Rodriguez could see into the window of what intelligence had confirmed was Morrison's holding cell. The pilot was showing signs of the prolonged stress of captivity and interrogation. Rodriguez had watched enemy officers enter and leave the building multiple times each day, and he knew that the interrogation sessions were becoming more intense as the enemy grew frustrated with Morrison's refusal to cooperate. Rodriguez's orders were clear: maintain observation and provide intelligence for the official rescue operation when it was finally approved. Under no circumstances was he to take independent action that might compromise the larger mission. But as Rodriguez watched Morrison being led to another interrogation session, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The enemy installation was built into a natural bowl in the mountains, with steep ridges providing excellent defensive positions on all sides. Rodriguez had identified 17 guard posts, 3 vehicle checkpoints, and multiple overlapping fields of fire that would make any conventional assault extremely costly. But he had also identified a critical weakness in their defensive plan. The enemy had positioned their forces to repel an attack by a large rescue force approaching from the valley floor. They had not adequately prepared for a single sniper operating from the high ground overlooking their position. Rodriguez's elevated position gave him clear sight lines into most of the facility, including the guard towers and command bunker. Rodriguez opened his encrypted communication device and sent a brief message to his command post. Observation position compromised by enemy patrol. Relocating to alternate site. Will maintain surveillance. It was a lie, but it would buy him the time he needed to implement his plan without interference from his superiors. Rodriguez knew he would face serious consequences for disobeying orders, but he had made his choice. Captain Morrison was running out of time, and Rodriguez was in a position to do something about it. Rodriguez began his plan at 0300 hours, using the darkness to move closer to the enemy perimeter. His target was the communication array that connected the installation with enemy headquarters. If he could disable their communications, The facility would be isolated and unable to call for reinforcements during his rescue attempt. Moving like a ghost through the rocky terrain, Rodriguez covered the 2 miles to the communications site in under an hour. The facility was guarded by only 2 sentries, both of whom were more concerned with staying warm in the mountain cold than maintaining proper security watch. Rodriguez eliminated both guards silently with his knife, then planted explosive charges on the main transmission equipment. The explosions lit up the night sky and immediately threw the enemy installation into confusion. Rodriguez could see soldiers running to defensive positions, expecting an imminent attack by a large force. But instead of attacking, Rodriguez returned to his overwatch position and prepared for the next phase of his plan. Rodriguez waited until morning before beginning the psychological warfare phase of his operation. Using his sniper rifle, he began systematically eliminating enemy personnel who exposed themselves in predictable patterns. A guard who stepped outside for a cigarette at the same time every morning, an officer who walked between buildings without varying his route, a sentry who became careless about his exposure when he thought no one was watching. Each shot was carefully planned and precisely executed. Rodriguez wasn't trying to kill large numbers of enemy soldiers. He was trying to create fear and confusion that would disrupt their normal procedures. After each shot, he would change position slightly, making it appear that multiple snipers were operating around the perimeter. The psychological effect was exactly what Rodriguez had hoped for. Enemy forces began staying under cover, abandoning their normal patrol schedules and security procedures. Officers became reluctant to move between buildings, and guard posts were reinforced to the point where they became overcrowded and inefficient. By the afternoon of the second day, Rodriguez could see that his plan was working. The enemy was so focused on dealing with the sniper threat that they had reduced the guard force around Morrison's holding facility. But Rodriguez knew he had to act quickly, before enemy reinforcements arrived or his ammunition ran low. Rodriguez moved to his final firing position, a rocky ledge that gave him a direct line of sight to Morrison's cell window. Through his scope, he could see the pilot sitting on his cot, apparently unaware that rescue was imminent. Rodriguez also identified the 2 guards stationed outside Morrison's cell door, along with the roving patrol that checked the building every 30 minutes. The timing would have to be perfect. Rodriguez would have perhaps a 10-minute window between patrol checks to eliminate the guards, breach the cell, and escape with Morrison before enemy forces could respond. It was an incredibly risky plan that depended on everything going exactly right, but Rodriguez could see no alternative. Rodriguez waited until the roving patrol had completed its check and moved on to the next building. Then he began his assault on Morrison's prison. His first shot eliminated the guard at the main entrance to the building. His second shot took out the sentry at the rear exit. Rodriguez then left his firing position and began moving rapidly toward the building, knowing that enemy forces would soon converge on the area. Rodriguez reached Morrison's cell window just as alarms began sounding throughout the installation. He could see the pilot looking up in confusion as gunfire echoed from around the facility. Rodriguez tapped on the window with his rifle barrel and saw Morrison's face transform with hope and disbelief. "American sniper," Rodriguez called out quietly. "Move away from the window." Rodriguez used a small explosive charge to blow out the cell window, then squeezed through the opening into Morrison's cell. The pilot was ready to move, having quickly gathered his few possessions when he realized rescue was at hand. "Who are you?" Morrison asked as Rodriguez checked his equipment. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, 75th Ranger Regiment. We need to move now. Can you travel?" "I can travel," Morrison replied with conviction. "Just get me out of here." Rodriguez led Morrison out of the cell and through the building to a rear exit he had identified during his surveillance. Enemy soldiers were beginning to search the facility systematically, but they were still confused about the location and size of the attacking force. Rodriguez's psychological warfare had convinced them they were facing a large special operations team rather than a single sniper. The escape route Rodriguez had planned took them through a drainage culvert that ran under the installation's perimeter fence. It was a tight fit for both men with their equipment, but it provided concealment from the searching enemy forces. They emerged from the culvert system about 200 yards outside the perimeter, in a small ravine that offered cover from observation. "Where's the extraction team?" Morrison asked as they began climbing toward the ridgeline. "There is no extraction team," Rodriguez admitted. "Just me. But I know where we can find transportation." Rodriguez had identified an enemy vehicle park about a mile from the main installation. During his surveillance, he had observed that the area was lightly guarded and contained several all-terrain vehicles that could navigate the mountain roads. If they could reach the vehicle park and commandeer transportation, they might be able to escape the area before enemy forces could organize an effective pursuit. The climb to the vehicle park took them through some of the roughest terrain Rodriguez had ever traversed. Morrison was weakened by his captivity but determined to keep up with the pace Rodriguez set. Behind them, they could hear helicopters taking off from the enemy installation as search teams began expanding their hunt for the escaped prisoner and his rescuer. Rodriguez reached the vehicle park as dawn was breaking over the mountains. 2 guards were on duty, but they were focused on watching the access road rather than the steep approach Rodriguez and Morrison were using. Rodriguez eliminated both sentries quickly and quietly, then selected a rugged 4-wheel drive vehicle that looked capable of handling the mountain trails. "Can you drive?" Rodriguez asked Morrison as he hot-wired the vehicle. "I can drive anything with wheels," Morrison replied. "Where are we going?" "There's a friendly outpost about 40 miles north of here. If we can reach it, we'll be safe." Rodriguez knew that 40 miles through enemy-controlled mountain territory would be an extremely dangerous journey. Enemy forces would soon discover their escape route and begin pursuing them with vehicles and aircraft. But it was their only option for reaching safety before being recaptured. The vehicle started on the first try, and Rodriguez began driving through the mountain trails at a speed that bordered on reckless. Behind them, they could already see helicopters beginning to search the area around the vehicle park. The chase was beginning, and Rodriguez knew it would be a race against time to reach friendly territory. For the next 6 hours, Rodriguez and Morrison raced through mountain valleys and over rocky passes, staying ahead of their pursuers through a combination of tactical driving, local knowledge, and pure determination. Several times they had to abandon the main trails and drive cross-country when they encountered enemy checkpoints or patrol vehicles. Morrison proved to be an excellent driver when Rodriguez needed to rest, handling the vehicle with the same skill he had shown as a pilot. The 2 men worked together seamlessly, taking turns at the wheel, while the other navigated and watched for threats. As they approached the area where friendly forces were known to operate, Rodriguez made radio contact with American units using his emergency communication equipment. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Multiple aircraft were scrambled to provide air cover while ground forces moved to establish a secure landing zone for their extraction. Rodriguez and Morrison reached the rendezvous point just as American helicopters appeared overhead. The extraction was swift and professional, with both men aboard the rescue aircraft within minutes of reaching the landing zone. As they lifted off and headed toward friendly territory, Rodriguez looked back at the mountains where they had spent the last week fighting for survival. "Why did you do it?" Morrison asked Rodriguez as they flew toward safety. "You risked everything to save someone you'd never met." Rodriguez considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because that's what we do. We leave no one behind, no matter what it costs." At 3 months later, Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez stood at attention in the Pentagon as the Secretary of Defense pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on his uniform. Captain Jake Morrison stood nearby, having recovered fully from his ordeal and returned to flight status. The official citation mentioned Rodriguez's extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for his own safety in the successful rescue of a fellow service member from enemy captivity. What the citation didn't mention was that Rodriguez had been court-martialed for disobeying direct orders and conducting an unauthorized rescue operation. The charges had been quietly dropped after Morrison's debriefing revealed the intelligence value of his successful escape, but Rodriguez's military career had been forever changed by his decision to act independently. Rodriguez didn't regret his choice. As he looked out at the audience filled with military leadership and Morrison's family members, he knew he had made the right decision. Sometimes following orders wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to follow your conscience, even if it meant risking everything you had worked for. Captain Jake Morrison returned to flying missions within 6 months of his rescue, but he never forgot the sniper who had risked his career and his life to bring him home. The 2 men remained close friends, bound together by their shared experience in the mountains and their understanding that some bonds forged in combat can never be broken. Rodriguez's final decision had indeed brought Morrison home, but it had cost him far more than either man could have imagined. The price of doing what was right, Rodriguez learned, was sometimes higher than anyone should have to pay. But for both men,
The knowledge that they had honored their commitment to leave no one behind made that price worth paying.